Welcome to the 9th Annual Detroit River Evening. My name is Carolyn O'Neill, and I'm the manager of the Great Lakes Office at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks here in Ontario. I am new to the Detroit team and excited to be part of it, and I'm excited to be part of this evening. Tonight, we're here to share with you some of our successes in remediating the Detroit River over the past year. We hold these events once per year to provide an opportunity to engage the local community in progress to date. This 9th meeting is the first time we are hosting a Detroit River celebration virtually. We'll hear from several partners about their work on the river, as well as from Tom Henderson, the Public Advisory Council Chair with Detroit River Canadian Cleanup. You may have noticed that your videos and microphones are unavailable to you. We are maintaining this throughout the webinar. Any questions you have for the presenters can be put in the question and answer box, and we will go through them once all the presentations are complete. So when asking a question, please indicate who the question is for. For those of you who are not so familiar, the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup is a community-based partnership between federal, provincial, and municipal governments, local industries, researchers, environmental organizations, and citizens working together to protect, restore, and enhance the Detroit River. We are working to strengthen our relationships with First Nations and Métis. Why are we here? Well, as many of you are aware, due to intense urbanization and industrialization, the Detroit River's ecosystem became degraded for plants, animals, and humans alike. So, as a result, in around 1987, the river was designated one of 43 areas of concern under the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Excuse me. The Detroit River Canadian Cleanup, or DRCC, implements the cleanup program for the Remedial Action Plan, or RAP as it's known, for the Canadian side of the Detroit River area of concern. And now I would like to welcome Jackie Saran, Remedial Action Plan Coordinator for the the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup, to provide an overview of the progress made on the Remedial Action Plan over the past 2019-2020 year.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And welcome everyone to our 9th Annual Detroit River Evening. We're so happy to have you. And I'm going to start off, as Carolyn mentioned, by providing a brief update of the DRCC's progress over the past year. So my talk is titled Tipping the Scales of Progress, the DRCC and Remedial Action Plan Progress. So as Carolyn mentioned, in 1987, the Detroit River was listed as a Great Lakes Area of Concern. But how do we know when an area of concern is no longer an area of concern? We measure the cleanup of areas of concerns through these 14 beneficial use impairments that you see on your screen. The Detroit River offers several ecological, recreational, and economic beneficial water uses. When something interferes with the enjoyment of a water use, it is called a beneficial use impairment. And using scientific studies and data, the status of each beneficial use was determined as being impaired or not impaired, and this was done back in 2010 for the Detroit River. And on occasion, there was insufficient data to make a status determination, and so these beneficial uses were deemed to require further assessment. And each impaired beneficial use impairment has criteria that must be met in order for it to be considered not impaired. And I wanted to mention just one thing about the Area of Concern program. So the hope isn't to take the Detroit River back to a pristine environment, although we would all love that. But the analogy we use is that we want to get it out of the emergency room and back to being similar to other areas of the Great Lakes that are much less degraded. So progress towards these beneficial uses in 2019-2020. So we were able to do and make progress on 2 habitat projects. So we have the Collavino Wetland Restoration Project on the left. You can see we installed some pumping infrastructure there, and that'll allow us to manipulate the water levels. And on the right, we've made progress towards construction of an erosion mitigation and habitat enhancement project at Peche Island. I'll provide more information about these projects in my presentation coming up after this one. And we've also been doing a bunch of research and monitoring on the river. So over the past year, we had phytoplankton and zooplankton sampling. So Scientists from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada went out on the river from July to November 2019 and sampled 8 sites within the Detroit River for zooplankton and phytoplankton. We also had some coastal wetland monitoring, as well as we conducted a fish consumption survey. And these 3 things you'll hear more about throughout the evening. We also did some tree swallow research. So researchers have been examining hatching success and contaminant levels in tree swallow tissue. And tree swallows feed on insects that emerge from the sediment at the bottom of the river, where they may be exposed to toxic chemicals such as PCBs, mercury, and PAHs. By collecting and analyzing the eggs and plasma of these tree swallows, researchers can determine if contaminants are adversely affecting reproduction. And we're still awaiting the results on this sampling and hope to feature it in a future Detroit River evening. In addition to monitoring and research, the DRCC also does outreach and communication. So the DRCC put on outreach events this year, including our annual film screening and tree plantings, and also attended numerous community events. In 2019-2020, the DRCC attended 21 outreach events and engaged over 6,150 people. We also had over 1,400 volunteers come out to help us at our events, and approximately 28,000 trees, shrubs, and wildflowers were planted within the Detroit River watershed. And one neat thing that we established in 2019 was the Detroit River Coalition. So the Detroit River Coalition is made up of several river and tributary facing organizations from Michigan and Ontario that work together to promote the appreciation and conservation of the diverse natural heritage of the Detroit River from a binational and watershed perspective. And you can find out more on our website at www.detroitrivercoalition.com, but we plan to offer some events such as cleanups and things like that in the future, so stay tuned. And so I just wanted to really speak to the progress that we've made in cleaning up the Detroit River. So on the left, you can see 2010. And so those little icons indicate the 14 beneficial use impairments that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And you can see that of the 14 of them, only 3 of them were considered not impaired in 2010. Fast forward 10 years later, we have a bit more of an even picture now. So we have 7 BUIs that are considered impaired or require further assessment, and 7 BUIs that are now considered not impaired. So we've made great progress towards cleaning up the river. And I just wanted to especially highlight these 2 beneficial use impairments. So the fish tumors and the degradation of benthos beneficial use impairments. And so recently in April of 2020, we submitted assessment reports to both the Ontario government and the Canadian federal government to get the status of these changed to not impaired. So if that is to be successful, we will only have 5 remaining BUIs that are considered impaired or require further assessment. So progress is being made. And so every year in our Detroit River Evening, we update our Pathway to Delisting document, and this is a living work plan that details the remaining actions needed to satisfy the redesignation criteria for each BUI remaining. And so this can be downloaded on our website at www.detroitriver.ca. And on the website, you can also find more information about the projects, especially the communication and outreach projects, which we're not really going to go too far into detail on tonight, also on our website, so in our annual report. And so just to wrap up the brief presentation and the overview of the DRCC, the Detroit River is becoming a major destination for sport fishing. People come from all over the province for the walleye fishery and bass run, and we're seeing good progress with the return of species that haven't been seen in the river in decades, including bald eagles and lake sturgeon. We do have a significant amount of work still to do, but through commitment from our partners, including all 3 levels of government, the Conservation Authority, the university, and the public, we've come a very long way and should be very proud of our progress. So now I'm going to move on to our next agenda item and talk a bit about the 2 habitat projects that we've made progress on in 2019-2020. So habitat on the Detroit River has become degraded due to channelization of the river, hardening of shorelines, and removal of wetlands, among other reasons. In 2019-2020, we made progress on 2 restoration projects to build and improve upon habitat within the river. These 2 projects are the Collavino Wetland Restoration Project and the Peche Island Project. So I'm going to start out by talking about the Collavino Wetland Restoration Project. And I just wanted to give you an idea of whereabouts the wetland is located. So it's located at the mouth of the Canard River, which you can see here. And so here's the wetland here. And just to orient you, this is Malden Road and this is North Side Road. So it's in between the two roads. And so this is where the Collavino wetland, you can see there, is. And so most of the wetland habitat within the Collavino wetland is located within a dike impoundment. So you can see the dike here, this being the Canard River and this being the wetland. And the wetland is physically and hydrologically separated from the main Canard River. So our restoration goal was that the Collavino wetland be restored and managed primarily for the conservation and protection of important Canard River marsh habitat in order to benefit species at risk, as well as other marsh-dependent fish and wildlife plant species. And so in order to do this, the first step was to install pumping infrastructure. And the goal of this pumping infrastructure was to reinstate the water level manipulation functionality to allow us to better manage the wetland. So for example, we could draw down the water within the wetland, cut down the Phragmites, which is an invasive species, and then bring the water level back up in order to drown out the Phragmites. So you can see here, here's the intake pipe that brings water from the Canard River into the wetland, and then the discharge pipe, which brings it out of the wetland into the Canard River, and the pumping infrastructure here. I'll show you a bit of what that looks like on the actual ground. So the far left picture, you can see this is the Canard River, and so we have the intake and discharge pipes that we installed over winter 2019. And this is a more recent picture of the pumping infrastructure that allows us to pump the water to and from the Canard River in the wetland. And the far right, you can see the infrastructure in the wetland. So we did some shoreline protection in the wetland, as well as we installed the pipes, which you can't see well, but they are located here. And so the future plans for the wetland is to restore the wetland from its currently degraded state to a rich, diverse, native species dominated condition. And we're looking at enhancing habitat quality and quantity for species at risk in flora and fauna. And we've noticed that, which Joe will speak to later, is that we'd like to try to attract some marsh birds to the wetland as well. So that's the plan for the Collavino wetland, and we're hoping to do that work over the next year. As for Peche Island, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of where Peche Island is located. So it's located near where, at the beginning of the Detroit River, essentially, as it comes out of Lake St. Clair, to the east of Belle Isle. And Peche Island has important habitat. It's a city-owned park, and it has high biodiversity in its surrounding waters and on the island itself, including 22 species of rare plants, 2 rare reptile species, critical habitat for species at risk, and numerous birds that utilize the island for their life stages. And the island has been designated an environmentally sensitive area, and the marsh on the island is a provincially significant wetland. But unfortunately, Peche Island is eroding. So you can see on the left an aerial photograph from 1931 and compared to an aerial photograph from 2017. And you can see that in 1931, there was a bunch of land in the middle, which no longer exists in 2017. And in 1931, there were some beaches on the island, which also no longer exist due to high water levels and erosion these days. And the picture on the right was when we went to Peche Island last summer in June of 2019. And you can see that large chunks of the land of Peche Island are eroding into the river, including ones with trees on them. So our solution to the problem, we wanted to design it to serve dual purposes. So we wanted to protect the island from erosion, as well as create habitat for fish, including species at risk. So you can see here in the northeast section of the project, we're proposing to build a revetment, which I'll get into a bit later. And we're also looking on the north side of the island to build some offshore sheltering islands. And so the revetment would look something similar to this, although ours will use a bit larger rock, but just wanted to give you an idea of what the revetment will look like on the northeast side, as well as the sheltering island. So you can see a cross section of the sheltering island here. The core of the sheltering island is smaller rocks, and then as you go up and out, the sheltering island has, the rocks get a bit larger. So, and it will look something similar to this. So this is a sheltering island that exists already near Peche Island, but ours will be on a lot bigger scale. And so I mentioned that we wanted to build this project with habitat in mind. So the northern sheltering islands, which are these here, will dissipate the wave energy from passing freighters and create a calm water area behind the islands. So the calm water area here is outlined in yellow. And these types of calm water areas are rare in the upper Detroit River. And the area is pretty large, so it's estimated at 105,000 square meters. So that's, to give you an idea, almost 20 football fields in size. So the calm water area will allow for aquatic vegetation to grow and provide important habitat for species. And so I wanted to speak to those habitat benefits in particular. So we put in some features specifically for the northern mad tom and channel darter, which are species at risk, and they've been known to frequent the Peche Island area. And so fish will be able to lay eggs and spawn in the crevices provided by the rock islands themselves. And you can see an example of this in the photo on your left. And we expect the northern mad tom to use these areas because they're cavity spawners. So they've even been known to spawn in Coke cans if allowed to. So, and then the backwater area will also contribute to the growth of aquatic vegetation. So this vegetation can provide cover or allow fish that require vegetation to spawn to use it for their spawning. And so the project status is that we're awaiting permits on the Peche Island project. We have Transport Canada permits, but we're currently waiting on some Department of Fisheries and Oceans permits, which we expect to be provided at the end of the month. And with that, we expect construction to begin at the end of summer 2020, with the completion of the project in December 2020. And one interesting thing is that monitoring of the fish habitat benefits will occur 1 and 3 years post-construction. So we'll have a better idea of how much of a benefit our project provided for fish, and we can use that information when constructing future habitat projects like these in the river. So thank you. I just wanted to provide you with a reminder that if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So for now, I'm going to switch it over to Mark Fitzpatrick, who will provide a brief update on the phytoplankton and zooplankton monitoring in the Detroit River.
So as Jackie was telling you, yes, obviously, you know, we're all familiar with fish because they're easy to catch and easy to see. But as you get much smaller organisms are also there, phytoplankton and zooplankton in particular, which I'll talk about. They're typically depicted as a pyramid when you're representing food webs, because when you actually figure out how many there are and how much they weigh, there's an awful lot of them and an awful lot more there in terms of biomass than there are larger organisms. So we're getting a lot of background on phytoplankton and zooplankton as we go through our slides, but yeah, the term itself, phytoplankton, means wandering plants, and really these are algae, broadly speaking, but they are a particular kind of algae that live in the water column. So they do photosynthesize, and they do provide food for zooplankton and other microbes. And this is just a few examples of some of the different types that we saw in the river in the course of our study. We also looked at what we call the microbial loop, or various tiny organisms that also live in the water. Those include some very, very small phytoplankton, which we just use the term autotrophic picoplankton. Those, what you're seeing there, are magnified 1,000 times, so they're really tiny. We also see bacteria in the water, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Very tiny. You can barely make them out in that picture there. But they're obviously, but they do have an important ecosystem function, breaking down, recycling energy, and also can be a source of food for other organisms. We have also organisms called ciliates, which are another single-celled planktonic organisms that are there, as well as the larger zooplankton. which are more of the fish food. The term itself, wandering animals, they can feed on phytoplankton, but they can also eat bacteria and other microbes themselves, and they can be and also be an important source of food for different types of fish. So we can move on. Let's go on to the next slide. So, and talk about more the objectives of our study. So this was really designed to get at, you know, what's happening in the river, because there had been a couple studies here and there, but it really wasn't, it wasn't very well studied. So what we wanted to do was, of course, sample them and look at them under the microscope and really just catalog what's there. So we included the phytoplankton and zooplankton. As I mentioned, we included the microbial food web, which also includes bacteria, picoplankton, heterotrophic nanoflagellates, and ciliates. We did some experiments in the lab where we measured phytoplankton photosynthesis, or primary productivity as it's called, and bacterial productivity. And then we did a whole bunch of measurements of the water itself. We looking at temperature, flow rates, measured nutrients, and everything else. And the focus of this study was the Canadian area of concern, so the Canadian waters of the Detroit River. And what we were trying to figure out was that, is there anything happening to these phytoplankton and zooplankton within the area of concern that we could term an impairment? And to do this, broadly speaking, we were looking at differences between the nearshore and offshore and upstream and downstream, and trying to tease out if anything was happening there. And one of the things about this particular BUI is that it has often been confused with another BUI, BUI8, which is eutrophication or undesirable algae. So we were very much trying to separate that and focus in on what is really happening with the plankton communities. So we can move on to the next slide. So we chose 8 sites from up around Peche Island and down towards, and then down towards Boise Island. So basically from Lake St. Clair to about Amherstburg. And we did some offshore, we did some nearshore and offshore pairings to make sure at 6 of those sites to make sure we represented the habitats. And again, as I mentioned, to get an upstream and downstream gradient. And we tried to avoid the southern part of the river where it starts to mix more with Lake Erie. So we can move on. So having said all that, I thought it might be more useful and more informative if I presented the results as a comparison with some other areas of the Great Lakes where we've studied. So, you know, we've looked over in recent years at Niagara River, Toronto Harbor, Hamilton Harbor, and the Bay of Quinte. So we have all these sites where we've done similar type of work, and I think as I move ahead and show you, you know, look different graphs, that it really might give a bit of more context to those numbers. So we can move on then. So phytoplankton, so this is just the overall biomass. And that graph also depicts various groups, including blue-greens and diatoms. But what you can see here is that the Detroit River, the biomass is actually very low. You know, it's 0.2 to 0.3 grams per cubic meter. You know, compare that to, say, Hamilton Harbor or the Bay of Quinte at the other end of the graph, where there's 10 times as much biomass. Now, those are areas that see frequent algal blooms during the summer and fall months. So quite a bit different system. So numbers are generally very low, and actually in fact lower than what we see out in Lake Ontario. Looking at the microbial loop, again, you can barely see the Detroit River on that graph. So those black bars depict bacteria. So we've seen quite a bit of that in terms of biomass in some of the other sites, especially the Niagara River, Toronto Harbor, Hamilton, and Bay of Quinte. So those are quite low numbers there. You know, the other major component of the microbial food web are the heterotrophic nanoflagellates, which kind of look like planets in that little graph there. And you can see we aren't really seeing a lot of them in the Detroit River compared to other areas around the Great Lakes. Similar story with the zooplankton community. The Detroit River site is circled there. But again, much lower than the other sites in the Bay of Quinte or Hamilton or wherever. Just generally very low biomass of these organisms throughout the system. So we can move on. So again, I mentioned we did primary productivity, which is essentially the algal photosynthesis rates. So you can see you know, more eutrophic algal bloom sites have extremely high rates, up around 50 to 60 milligrams of carbon per cubic meter per hour. The Detroit River is down around 10, which is low. But what's interesting is, given the overall low biomass, it's actually relatively high. So what that really is getting at is that despite the fact that these organisms that there's not a lot of them there, they are active. We did these experiments in the lab, so they do represent lab-based conditions, but what this shows is that when we take them and put them in the incubator and expose them to more optimal temperatures and light levels, they do respond positively and take off. So you know, that's generally a good sign and suggests that they're healthy. I should have pointed out this picture in the lab that was taken a few years ago. Obviously, we couldn't put that many people in our lab now, given the social distancing requirements, but that's how busy the lab can be some days. The other thing we looked at was, sorry, if we can go back, the other thing we looked at were bacterial growth rates in the river. You can see Detroit River is kind of in line with what we see in Hamilton Harbor, but far less than what we've seen in Toronto Harbor and the Inner Harbor. So overall, that's generally a positive thing. So we can move on. The other thing is just sort of to give the overall relative composition of the various components of the lower trophic levels, the phytoplankton, zooplankton. So I like to call this the fish food. What starts at the bottom works its way up. And what you can see in the Detroit River is that when you look at that sort of, if you think of the food or the energy as organic carbon, then about 80% of that in the Detroit River is coming from the phytoplankton. If you compare that to some of the other ecosystems like Toronto Harbor, it's only about 45%. There's a much stronger, in some of the other areas of concern especially, I picked these ones in particular because they are listed as impaired. So in some of the more impaired sites, we have a much stronger prevalence of microbial organisms there, bacteria and H&F in particular, that we're not seeing in the Detroit River. Okay, so we can move on. So just kind of to sum up, so the phytoplankton and zooplankton populations are linked by both direct grazing of zooplankton, phytoplankton, and their interactions with the microbial food web, which includes bacteria, picoplankton, heterotrophic nanoflagellates, and ciliates. We did our survey throughout 2019 from the spring to the fall. We observed as I mentioned in the report, which is currently undergoing review, but we really observed relatively few differences in the planktonic communities within the AOC that we would attribute to that could be attributed to any sort of impairment. It's just really what you'd expect to find in a river. So that was really a positive finding. And that's evidenced, as I mentioned, in the planktonic food web or the carbon pool, which is really much dominated by the phytoplankton, by the photosynthesizers. And it's very different from what we see in the other AOCs. And that's sort of where we end off. So we certainly didn't find any evidence of anthropogenic impairment in these populations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to the next steps towards redesignating this beneficial use impairment for the Detroit River. So thanks again. And so now we're going to switch it over a bit to talk about wetlands. So since 2011, researchers have assessed the condition of coastal wetland habitat and communities at selected sites in the Detroit River watershed from 2011 to 2018. And so researchers looked at water quality, submerged aquatic vegetation, aquatic macroinvertebrates, and breeding marsh bird communities. Next, we will hear from Joe Fiorino, a Canadian Wildlife Services scientist who is part of the Detroit River Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program.
Thanks, Jackie. Let's get my screen up here. All right. Okay, hopefully that's full screen. Everyone can hear me okay?
Looks good.
That's awesome, great. So hello everyone, as Jackie said, my name is Joe Fiorino and I work for the Canadian Wildlife Service. And today I'm going to talk about some of the coastal wetland monitoring work we've done in the Detroit River area of concern over the last 8 years. Yeah, about 8 years. All right, so I don't think I have a ton of time to get through everything I want to get through, so I'm going to get right into it. So our team with the Canadian Wildlife Service monitors and assesses coastal wetland condition or health for a number of different projects and programs. This obviously includes the Area of Concern program, where we survey wetlands to report on elements of beneficial use impairments, like Jackie mentioned earlier. Just to kind of redefine beneficial use impairments, or BUIs. So they're a common set of impairments that were created by the International Joint Commission to describe changes in the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of the Great Lakes. And the Canadian Wildlife Service focuses on the wildlife component of 2 beneficial use impairments. So these are BUI 3 and BUI 14, degradation of fish and wildlife populations and loss of fish and wildlife habitat. I crossed out fish there because we leave the fish side of things to the DFO. So where have we surveyed? So since 2011, we've consistently monitored 5 wetlands in the Detroit River AOC. And that represents actually a fairly large proportion of the total remaining wetland area in the entire corridor. So we've also monitored 3 wetlands outside of the AOC on Lake St. Clair. And we typically use those as a measuring stick by which to compare the Detroit River AOC coastal wetlands. And when we get out to these sites, our monitoring protocol involves collecting data on different geophysical and biotic components of these wetlands, including water quality, submerged aquatic vegetation, aquatic macroinvertebrates, and marsh nesting birds. So we monitor water quality because water quality really is the foundation of coastal wetland health. We survey submerged aquatic vegetation because it's an important component of fish habitat and also provides food for birds. Likewise, aquatic macroinvertebrates are an important food source for many fish species, or many species in general, but also are a really good environmental indicator of recent water quality changes because they are really sensitive to environmental change. And lastly, we survey marsh nesting birds because they're also sensitive to environmental disturbance, and they give us a good indication of the quality and the quantity of available habitat for wildlife. And then once we go out and we collect all these data, we need a meaningful and intuitive way to communicate the condition or the health of a given marsh. So what we do is we take the parameters that we collect and we summarize them into useful indices. So for example, one of the tools we use is called the Water Quality Index, and that's an index that combines measurements of water temperature, pH, turbidity, and conductivity to characterize water quality. So turbidity is just basically analogous to water clarity, and conductivity gives us an indication of things like fertilizer or road salts that end up in the water. So in here I provided a table that just provides the range of water quality index values ranging from -3 to +3, as well as the interpretation of those scores. So the only real important thing to take from this table is the difference between a good and a degraded water quality index score. So the threshold is a score of 0, below which we'd say that water quality is degraded. And then for values above 0, we'd say that water quality is in good or very good or excellent condition. So likewise, we also have developed indices that we can use to summarize biological data, which we call indices of biotic integrity, or IBIs. So these IBIs combine different aspects of a given biological community. For example, it could be with the richness or the abundance of a certain group of species. And these indicate the ability of a habitat to support and maintain healthy wildlife populations. So this is just like intuitively, it's pretty similar to the water quality index, but it's slightly different in that the scores range from 0 to 100. And in this case, we consider our threshold for what would be considered good condition to be 40. So above 40 could be what we would consider to be good, very good, or excellent condition for a given biological community. And getting into some of the results. So just give you some context of what you're looking at here. So on the y-axis, I'm just going to pull out my laser pointer here. This is the water quality index score. On the x-axis, we have the 8 different years that we've done surveys. The blue bars are the average water quality index score for the 5 wetlands that we've consistently surveyed in the Detroit River. And then the green bars are the 3 coastal wetlands that we've surveyed in Lake St. Clair that are not in the AOC. So these are the wetlands that we're comparing to. And then we have this red dashed line that goes all the way across here. That's representing our lower limit of what we would consider to be a good water quality index score. So that value of 0. And what we've seen for the first 4 years of sampling from 2011 to 2014, you can see those blue bars were consistently below that red line, that red dashed line, indicating that water quality was in a degraded condition, or at least the average of those 5 sites for the Detroit River. Alternatively, over the last 4 years, we've actually seen a notable increase in water quality for those five coastal wetlands, and to the point where now it's actually the average water quality for those 5 sites is right in line with what we would consider to be in good condition, right around 0. And that's been primarily driven by a decrease in turbidity and conductivity at a few of the sites that we survey. Okay, so moving on to aquatic vegetation. So this is kind of a similar figure to what we just looked at for water quality, but now you'll notice that the y-axis has changed to IBI score, and this range was from 0 to 100. And these, if you recall, the IBI score is analogous to community condition, with higher scores indicating healthier conditions. So in this case, a higher score would indicate an aquatic vegetation community that is in good or better condition. And what we see is these blue bars, which once again represent the Detroit River AOC average, in general are fairly comparable to what we see in Lake St. Clair for those Lake St. Clair non-AOC sites. And also, the scores have consistently been over that threshold of 40, indicating that the aquatic vegetation community has been in good or better condition for the last for the 8 years of sampling that I'm presenting here. And then moving on to aquatic macroinvertebrates, so similar figures before. In this case, one notable difference is we do tend to see a difference in the aquatic macroinvertebrate IBI scores when we compared the Detroit River AOC to Lake St. Clair. So it's about 20 points lower. So you can see on average between these two bars represents about 20 points, indicating that the condition of coastal wetlands in the Detroit River in terms of the macroinvertebrate community tends to be a bit worse than Lake St. Clair. That being said, throughout the 8-year study period, we've seen that the average score has been consistently at or above that 40 threshold line. And once again, our interpretation there would be that the aquatic macroinvertebrate community in the Detroit River AOC is considered in good condition. And looking at marsh birds, this is where things are a bit different. So you'll probably notice right away that those blue bars representing the average IBI score for the Detroit River are far lower, especially when we compare them to the Lake St. Clair non-AOC sites. And beyond that, the average marsh bird IBI score has been consistently below that threshold of what we would consider to be a good score. So this indicates to us, kind of in a practical sense, that the Detroit River AOC sites have a lower richness and or a lower abundance of species that depend on marshes for nesting. So those could be species like least bittern, common gallinule, American coot, American bittern, those species that really rely on marshes for different life stages, especially nesting. So we've spent, I'm kind of running out of time here, but we've spent at least the last year and a half now really investigating these low marsh bird IBI scores, including last year we surveyed some additional sites in the Detroit River that we hadn't previously surveyed in order to get a more complete picture of what's going on with the marsh bird community. We've also been putting a lot of thought into different management actions that can be taken to improve marsh bird community condition in the corridor as a whole. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that, Joe. We look forward to receiving the report outlining your results. So next up is me. So I'm going to take the microphone for the next presentation and discuss fish consumption in the Detroit River. So when contaminant levels such as mercury and PCBs are high in fish, consumption advisories may recommend that people and sensitive populations, for example, children and pregnant women, limit or avoid eating certain species of fish caught in specific areas in the river. So in 2019, the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup launched a fish consumption survey to collect data on what people catch and eat from the river to help inform the restrictions on fish and wildlife consumption beneficial use impairment. So I'm going to present some of these findings now. So I just wanted to provide a brief overview and a bit of a background on the fish consumption survey. So the consumption survey was launched on July 29th, 2019, And the goal was to do it online and in person. And we distributed the survey information through social media, newsletters, posters, postcards, media releases, and we also did some interviews on radio as well as in the news to try to get word out about the survey. Now, obviously, we are planning on getting out there to interview anglers in the summer of 2020, but weren't able to do so due to COVID-19 concerns. So it's mostly online. So to date, we have had 163 people fill out our survey, and I just wanted to give a bit of a background of the demographics of the participants, so who these people are. So the majority of survey respondents were male at 72%, and they were aged between 18 and 64 mostly. And so of the participants, we asked them how long they fished the Detroit River, and many of them, the majority of participants, around about 100, said that they have fished the Detroit River for over 5 years. So our survey seemed to capture people who were passionate about angling and have been doing this for several years. And then we also asked them, do you eat fish you catch from the Detroit River? So most of them did. So 74% of them did say that they eat the fish that they catch from the Detroit River, with only 26% or 43 of them saying that they did not. And we were curious about the people who did not eat fish from the Detroit River as to why they didn't eat it. So we asked them, why don't you eat the fish that you catch? And so many of them cited the reason that they didn't eat the fish was because they like to practice catch and release. So that was about 25 of the people who said that they don't eat the fish. And then the secondary reasons are that the water is polluted and I think the fish are diseased. So it's a bit of a good sign that people thinking that the water is polluted or the fish are diseased is not the #1 answer for why they are not eating fish from the Detroit River. And so for those who did eat fish from the Detroit River, we asked them, how much fish do you typically eat in a typical meal? So many of them responded and told us that they ate 8 ounces of fish. So just to give you an idea of what 8 ounces looks like, 8 ounces is about the size of 2 palms of your hand. 4 ounces is about the size of 1 palm of your hand. So they're eating about mostly a fillet the size of both of the palms of your hands. And then we also asked them how many meals of fish caught from the Detroit River do they eat. So many of them eat 1 to 4 meals of Detroit River fish per month. So that averages out to be about 1 per week or less. And some people only eat it very occasionally, so only have 1 to 3 meals per year, which was kind of interesting to see the frequency. And we asked them who they share the fish that they catch with. So many of them do share the fish, with only under 10 of them responding and saying that they only, the only people who eat the fish is themselves. So most of them share them with their spouse or partner and other family members, and people within their social group. So that's who they tend to share the fish with. And so I didn't want to present, we asked each person how much and how often they eat various types of fish, but I wanted to focus on these specific 3 fish species, so brown bullhead, smallmouth bass, and walleye, because these are specifically mentioned as indicator species in our criteria for determining whether this BUI can be considered non-impaired. So brown bullhead is a bottom feeder, so typically not, when you're looking for safe fish to eat, typically not the best choice out there. And we realized that people don't eat brown bullhead very often. Only 17% or 20 of survey participants who ate fish from the Detroit River identified that they have eaten brown bullhead over the past year. And we have more people who eat smallmouth bass. So 51 of the 120 identified that they eat smallmouth bass over the past year. And walleye is extremely popular in the Detroit River. It's known for its walleye fishery. So 105 out of the 120, or 88% of the people identified that they have eaten walleye over the past year. And when they do eat walleye, they tend to eat it about 1 time per month, with the second response being rarely, and the third response 1 time per week. So they aren't eating walleye too frequently, but walleye is a popular fish that's eaten from the Detroit River. And so when they do eat walleye or the other indicator species, we wondered how much they eat of it. And so most of them for walleye if you're looking. Eat about 8 ounces of walleye, which again is those 2 palms of your hand. And then we wanted to know how they typically cook the fish they catch from the Detroit River. So there are some guidelines on how to eat fish and how to cook fish so that you reduce the contaminants within it. So they include trimming visible fat and cooking fish on racks so that the fat can drip away. So most of the people fry their fish in a pan and then followed by grilled. So that's really interesting. And I think one of the more interesting things that we found from this fish guide is we wanted to know if people had heard of the Government of Ontario's Guide to Eating Ontario Fish. So this is the guide that outlines any fish consumption restrictions that are in place for specific fish that are caught in various areas of the Detroit River. And so 61% of the people we surveyed said that the people we surveyed and eat fish from the Detroit River said that they had heard of the Guide to Eating Ontario Fish, with 39% not hearing about the guide. And so we drilled down more deeply and we wanted to know if the people who knew about the guide used the guide to decide what type of fish they eat or how much of the fish they eat. And it's interesting that only 51% of the people who eat fish from the Detroit River use the guide to decide what type of fish they eat or how much they eat of it. And then we also asked them if they would like to eat more of any type of fish than the guide suggests. And so the majority said no, that they felt that the restrictions put in the Detroit River were sufficient and they didn't need to eat any more of a particular type of fish than the guide suggests. And so I just wanted to outline the next steps. That's kind of a brief overview. We plan to continue the survey until fall 2020. So if you haven't yet filled out the survey, it's available on our website. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. And the data will help us determine if there are any reasonable actions that can be done in the Detroit River to improve advisory. So for example, the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research did some modeling in the river, and they found that if we eliminated all PCBs from sediments in Canada, that the only consumption advisory that would improve is for freshwater drum. So looking at if people eat freshwater drum and what implications that could have is an important result of the survey. And so we expect an assessment report on this BUI to tell us whether it's impaired or not impaired anymore in spring of 2021. And I just wanted to remind everyone that fish caught from the Detroit River are safe to eat as long as they're eaten in accordance with the Guide to Eating Ontario Fish. So we get that question a lot, and they are safe to eat. You just have to make sure that you do it appropriately, so according to that guide. So thank you very much. So we've talked about the research towards cleaning the Detroit River, but an important component of the Detroit River Remedial Action Plan is involvement from the public. So the Public Advisory Council of the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup is a group of individuals that comes together to participate in the cleanup effort. They are the eyes and ears of the area of concern and are dedicated to ensuring that the river water quality and the ecosystem are improved and protected for all users of the river. I would like to welcome Tom Henderson, the chair of the Detroit River Canadian Public Advisory Council, to provide an update on their activities.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for that nice introduction. What is the Public Advisory Council? Well, as Jackie explained, it is connected with the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup, but it's composed of volunteers from different organizations like the Little River Enhancement Group, the Essex County Field Naturalists, the Citizens Environment Alliance, Friends of Canard River, as well as other interested folks unconnected with any group. We don't have, our government representatives are helpful, they assist, but it's a volunteer group, a watchdog group. And I've been the chairperson for the last 15 years. So what have we been doing? Well, we won't have any audio-visual stuff for you, just an oral report. But over the past year, the City of Windsor and the Windsor Port Authority have gotten together to expropriate land for a land swap that will enable the Ojibwe Shores property, the 33 acres on the river, to be connected with the remainder of the Ojibwe complex. Once it's completed, and they think it'll be completed this summer, we will have a beautiful 810-acre necklace of green stretching from the Detroit River all the way to Huron Church. To give you an idea how big that is, it's equivalent almost to Central Park in New York City and Belle Isle Park in the Detroit River. It's a monstrous area all within the City of Windsor, and it's ours. Speaking of the Ojibwe complex, the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority that last year donated $1.5 million to the City of Windsor for the construction of an eco-bridge that would span the Ojibwe Parkway and will connect the Black Oak Heritage Forest at Ojibwe Shores with the main Ojibwe complex across the railway tracks across the road. It will be an animals-only bridge that will allow deer and other animals to go back and forth. They have them out west. They're very handy for the animals. They love it, and it reduces roadkill by a whole lot. Me went to the City Council meeting in February to their budget deliberations, imploring, asking, begging City Council to increase its amount of money that they would spend to build that eco bridge and to go in partnership with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority. We'll see what happens. We also, in February, went to the annual meeting of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and asked them if they would partner with the City of Windsor to go 50-50 on building that eco bridge. The result, we didn't get turned down, but there was some room for encouragement there, and we will continue monitoring. Switching gears now to what's called the Canada-Ontario Agreement. The Canada-Ontario Agreement is between the province and the federal government to fund areas of concern across the province, St. Clair River, other places, and the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup. The funding, the contract runs out this year, and we have sent a letter to Premier Ford asking that the Ontario government renew the Canada-Ontario Agreement. And also, we sent a letter to Ira Kuzmerchuk, just recently elected MP from the federal side, so asking him to do what he can to see that the agreement is renewed. Generally, it goes in 4-year increments, and the funding will run out this fall for both, and we're hoping that it will be renewed so that the fine work that Jackie and others can do can continue. Now, in December, there was a major spill on the US side. It's called the Revere Copper Spill. It was a section of a dock fell into the river just west of the Ambassador Bridge, and all sorts of stuff poured into the river. It was discovered, it was reported on by Dave Battigello of the Windsor Star, who did a marvelous investigative reporting job. The Americans didn't even know what happened, but he knew. And he did some wonderful reporting in the Windsor Star. And we sent a letter of congratulations and a letter of thanks to the Star for Dave's reporting. He is monitoring it. There are remedial action plans going on in the meantime, and we will keep abreast of Dave's fine work and the work of the American officials. In October of last year, 2019, we invited from Michigan members of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy to present at a public meeting regarding what they're doing to remediate on the American side. Hotspots up and down the river, stretching from Belle Isle all the way to the mouth of the river down by Luna Pier. They were very cooperative. They explained their mapping procedures and their sediment remediation plans so that, again, remediation can occur. It may take time, but they're doing what they can. And near the we continue to attend meetings, Pac and Jackie. We attend meetings of the Friends of Detroit River, our US counterparts in Taylor, Michigan when we can. So to keep liaising with them, they treat us wonderfully. They always want to know, what are the Canadians thinking? What are their views? What is their opinion on things? We give them to them. They're very polite to us. And we have a very good relationship with the American side. No Trump fans in that group. And closing, we will, I wish to thank the efforts of our members that come to our meetings and are so active, especially the Vice Chair, Andy Paling, RAP Coordinator Jackie Sarin, her assistant, Jean Panunzio. I thank them from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that our PAC can continue in the tradition of what we've done for the last 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your update. So we're now going to move ahead with the question and answer period of our Detroit River evening. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So I'll go through them and ask various, whoever they're directed to. So I'm going to start. So Joe, question for you. What are the next steps for marsh birds, and what reasons have you considered as to why the marsh birds are poor in the Detroit River?
Sorry, I was having difficulty finding the unmute button there. So the next step, so one of the avenues we've explored over the last, I think I mentioned this at the end of the presentation, was we decided we needed a more complete picture of what was going on with the marsh bird community in the Detroit River AOC. So that led us to do some additional work last year in 2019 to survey 4 additional wetlands that we hadn't previously surveyed, which is actually pretty impressive all told, because between those new wetlands and the wetlands we had previously surveyed, it's pretty much all of the available wetland habitat that it currently exists in the Detroit River, in general. What we found was 1 or 2 sites that actually represented higher quality marsh bird habitat, and and one in particular was a managed site. It was managed particularly for waterfowl and seemed to represent high quality habitat. So one of the things that has come from this is the possibility of doing additional restoration work and looking for different sites that could provide opportunities to do that. Not that this necessarily comes together, but similar to what's happening with the Collavino right now. We'd expect that that restoration work that's happening with the Collavino wetland will result in high quality habitat for marsh birds in a fairly significant area right at the mouth of the Canard River.
Awesome. And another question for you, Joe. It's good to see that water quality in wetlands has improved. What do you think some of the reasons are for that?
So in general, we saw a bit of a decrease in turbidity and conductivity across all of our sites, but the most noticeable difference was at Turkey Creek, which is a tributary of the Detroit River just north of, I guess, Fighting Island, or right adjacent to the top of Fighting Island on the mainland. So it's hard to say exactly what would be attributed to that improvement in water quality, and perhaps some of the folks that are spend a little bit more of their time in that area will have an idea. But some general ideas, it could be related to management actions in the area. It could be something as simple as a reduction in the use of road salts in the watershed. or it could be something as simple as land use change in the surrounding watershed. Something, if an area is shifted from agricultural to a residential area, like that would substantially change what we'd expect the water quality to look like.
Awesome, that's great. All right, next question is for Mark. So you mentioned that zooplankton and phytoplankton are consistent with what you would find in riverine environments. What types of characteristics are found in riverine environments that make the zooplankton and phytoplankton like this?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, I think basically you would, the main thing is you generally would expect the biomass of both of these to be relatively low. And that's basically because of the riverine environment. And especially the faster the flow rate, the harder it is for them to really live. They get pushed around and shoved around. And so the first thing is you expect them to be low. In terms of the composition, you wouldn't expect necessarily to find, say, blooms of cyanobacteria, but if you did, you'd have a real problem. Mm-hmm. So that's really the kind of thing. You know, the general composition, I can speak more of the phytoplankton because that's where my expertise lies in this. But, you know, predominantly we saw diatoms and some smaller flagellates, things like that. And that's more typical of a river.
Awesome, that's great. All right, question for myself. So who are you working with and what are your partners on the Peche Island project? So great question. So we're working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, an organization called Swim Drink Fish. And if you haven't heard of them, I suggest that you Google it. They're doing a lot of great work making sure that waters are swimmable, fishable, and drinkable in Canada. So we're also working with the City of Windsor. They've been a great partner. They obviously own the land and have a vested interest in Peche Island and preserving it for the future. And we're also working with the Essex Region Conservation Authority. So those are the partners that we're working with to implement the Peche Island project. And so there was also, Justin has a question for Joe. If water quality IBI values vary greatly between sites and more specific degraded areas are found, would site-specific restoration be part of assessing overall river impairment? Or is having non-degraded average values the end goal, although they can obviously go hand in hand?
It's a good question. It's kind of a couple parts there. So would site-specific restoration be part of assessing the overall river impairment? Yeah, I think it is. So yeah, so break it down to two parts. So, or having non-degraded average values the end goal. You can kind of look at it in two ways. So I didn't want to get too much into I didn't really have time to get into kind of the specific delisting criteria that go along with those beneficial use impairments. But we've spent a lot of time talking about those and refining those over the last few years, and have discussed different aspects of whether, yeah, do you want the average of all these sites to be the end goal, the average to be considered non-degraded, or is it something that we should be looking at specific wetlands, having targeted restoration that improves water quality at, you know, a given site that seems to be especially impaired, and so forth. So I guess I don't have there isn't a specific answer here, but those both represent really like, I guess, different options of kind of answering the same problem.
Awesome. And then one clarification. So when Tom talked about the Revere copper site, there was some sediment that was spilled into the Detroit side of the river, so not the Canadian side. And they have a plan, if you're interested, on the Michigan Eagle website that outlines their plans for that going forward. And there was a public meeting and they're soliciting public comment. So if that's something you're interested in, I would definitely check that out. So is there any other questions anyone has? Seeing none. All right, let me just... So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming and to thank our presenters for giving informative talks on the important work they're doing for the Detroit River. We've made a lot of progress and we're proud of our current status and excited to continue this great work. We'd also like to thank our DRCC partners, including Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Essex Region Conservation Authority, the City of Windsor, Town of Amherstburg, and Town of LaSalle, the Windsor Port Authority, and numerous others who have helped us make progress on cleaning the river. On a final note, I'd just like to remind you that our 2019-2020 annual report, where you can find more information on the work we've done over the past year, is available for download from our website. And our updated work plan, the Pathway to Delisting document, can also be downloaded from our website. This document outlines our planned work over the next year and for future years going forward. And if you'd like to keep current on what the DRCC is up to, you can follow us on our various social media handles, which can be found on this slide. So thanks again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you soon.